Chess YouTube, what is happening? So, in today's video, we are reviewing the most famous game of chess ever played in the history of the game. And of course, I'm talking about the infamous cheating scandal game played between Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, and Hans Niemann, his new rival, the guy who just clobbered him plus Hikaru in this past week's Titled Tuesday tournament. And in this video, I'm breaking down the entire game, all of the moves, all of the variations, all of the ideas, all of the hidden possibilities you didn't see the first time through, and I'm going to show once and for all why Hans Niemann, in this game, he simply outplayed the GOAT Magnus Carlsen, and Magnus, the guy who's known to slam chessboards from time to time. He just had a bad day, and he was a little bit of a sore loser in this game. All right, in the game, Magnus opens 1d4. Hans Niemann, knight f6, c4, e6. So far, the most standard of standard 1d4 openings. And of course, here there are three main ideas for white. Knight c3, allowing the Nimzo-Indian defense with bishop b4. Also, knight f3 and g3 are also playable. But in the game, Magnus here, he has a very, very specific idea in mind for this game. He goes knight c3, inviting the Nimzo, and here black obliges. Bishop b4, Hans Niemann, a very principled player. He goes for the Nimzo-Indian defense, the idea being you pin this knight on c3 to the king on the e1 square, and therefore stop the move e4, as if white does go e4, you just take the pawn with the knight like this, and you win the free pawn. So Hans Niemann here, trying to fight for control of the very important e4 square like this. Now here, there are a lot of possibilities for white. The main moves here are queen c2 and e3 right here. But beyond that, there are many other sidelines, including a3, f3, and so on. But in this game, Magnus, he busts out a very specific idea, the move g3. Now, with this move, Magnus, he's sort of going for a hybrid between the Nimzo-Indian defense and the Catalan Opening. So, very interesting. Typically in the Catalan, you don't go knight c3 this early, as this is just not the best move for white. However, Magnus here, he's trying to throw his lower-rated opponent off guard in this game. In response, Hans, he follows the absolute main line. We have castles, bishop g2, d5. So Hans here, breaking in the center, sort of in the spirit of the Catalan, and now technically we are transposing back to Catalan territory. There is a line where black brings out the bishop like this, and technically white can go knight c3. So far, back into Catalan territory, and back in the year 2022, Magnus, he just played Jan Nepomniachtchi in the World Championship match, where he did bust out the Catalan, and ever since 2021, in that World Championship match, he's been playing the Catalan literally non-stop as white with excellent results. So no real surprise here. All right, now, what should white be doing here? Well, it turns out sooner or later, you really have to play this move a3, trying to drive back that bishop, or at least make a commit to, say, e7 or d6 or taking on c3. The longer you let the bishop there just live there and stay on c3 with all these possibilities, the worse it is for you as white. So here, Magnus, he simply goes a3 right away, and Hans has a choice. Do you want to go back to, say, e7 or d6, or do you just take on c3 right away and damage white's pawn structure? Well, turns out taking is the right move. It is the principled option, and here Hans does just that. He takes on c3. This is almost always the right response to an early a3 in the Nimzo from white, and of course white takes back like this. Now here we have a very interesting pawn structure. White sort of has these double pawns on the c file, but of course there is tension with the c pawn and the d5 pawn, meaning these pawns sooner or later likely will be traded off. And Hans here, he decides it's better to do it now than later, and he simply captures on c4 like this, winning the free pawn temporarily. Now, this line by Magnus is a pawn sacrifice. He's giving up his pawn on c4, and there's no easy way to win it back. Even if you go, say, queen to a4, black's going to have so many ways to fight back. For example, if you go queen to a4, then something like bishop d7, queen takes, and then bishop c6 would challenge white's light-scored bishop on here, and black would have a perfectly fine game. For example, queen a4, bishop d7, queen takes, bishop c6, and black would be fine. So instead of that, in the game, Magnus here, he simply goes knight f3, intending a fast castles on the king side. Overall, a good response. Now here, Hans Niemann, he's already castled. So far, so good. Now, how do you want to continue developing on the queen side? What is your plan? The middle game is sort of starting right now for Hans. He's got to find the right plan, the right way to proceed. Now, there are a couple of options here. There are a lot of lines in the Catalan where you take on c4, then you go, for example, knight c6, a6, b5, knight a5, rook b8, knight b3, and so on. Ideas like this. That is one strategy, but in the game, Hans goes for the slightly stronger and slightly simpler option, that is simply c5, expanding on the queen side right away. Now, this move, c5, is super common in the Queen's Gambit declined, in the Catalan Opening, in all kinds of 1d4 openings. So, no real surprise here. I do want to point out, Hans Niemann so far has spent 11 minutes so far in this game versus almost no time for Magnus. I believe the time control here is 1 hour and 30 minutes for all the moves, plus an extra 30 seconds per move. So Magnus here is blitzing out literally every move, and Hans Niemann is taking quite a bit more time, which is interesting considering Magnus in the post-conference said he wasn't sure if Hans was even thinking during the game, which is ironic considering Hans is the one spending all the time so far, but I digress. All right, from here, white castles, black takes on d4, c takes d4, that is the idea of c5, obviously trying to break in the center like this. And now Magnus has a very big choice. Do you take with the c-pawn, the queen, or the knight? And it turns out all of these moves are possible, but they all have their own pros and cons. If you take with the c-pawn like this, the challenge with that is black is going to have a 3 versus 1 pawn majority on the queen side, and black's idea in the long run is simple. Just push these pawns down the board, get more pass pawns, and try to win the game with your queen side pawn mass like that. So that would be a very double-edged idea, not necessarily bad, but certainly very committal. Beyond that, taking with the knight and the queen are both playable. And in the game here, Magnus, he captures with the queen like this. Queen takes d4 is the move. A solid choice, but Hans here, he just goes knight c6. And his idea is obvious. If you trade queens, black will be up a pawn, that being the extra pawn on c4, and black will have an edge in the endgame. I mean, not bad versus the goat. So obviously, white here, he cannot trade queens. Instead, queen takes c4 is the move played in the game. But now here, Hans, how does he continue? Well, he finds the strongest move, and, you know, I'm not sure if Magnus thought this move was the shocker move, but honestly, this move he plays right here is common in a lot of 1d4 openings, including the Rogozin. More on that in a minute. He plays the move e5. Now, the idea behind this, he wants to go bishop e6, finding a good square for his light squared bishop. Now, keep in mind, in the Catalan, in the QGD, the Queen's Gambit declined, this bishop is really the problem piece for black. It's trapped inside the pawn chain as soon as you go e6 on move 2. So if you can go, say, e5 like this and develop it, you're sort of solving the single biggest problem you have out of the opening. And if you can do that, you're likely fighting for equality early in the game. So e5, and by the way, this move is super common in, for example, the Rogozin variation of the QGD. For example, with, let's see here, bishop b4, if like knight f3, d5, and then here queen b3, there are a lot of lines where sooner or later black goes e5, bishop e6 like this in this line. I play this line as black, so I do know these things. So, you know, the move e5, not exactly the most shocking move ever. It's a common idea in different openings after 1d4. So here, Magnus, bishop g5 is the move. An interesting move. The idea is, of course, he's pinning the knight on f6 to the queen on d8, which puts some pressure in the black position. But the drawback of this move is black has the option of going bishop e6 right away, hitting the queen. So in order to avoid that, obviously black's pretty much guaranteed to go here with the bishop. There's no other good square. So with that in mind, maybe moving the queen out of harm's way earlier was the right idea. Like, for example, queen to b5 could be played right away. The queen's actually very safe on b5. But instead, bishop g5 played in the game, and the benefit of this is now the rooks control d1 twice. Therefore, rook fd1 or rook ad1 is possible. Whereas, of course, back here, rook d1 would lose the rook and the game on the spot. So you can't do that. So instead, bishop g5, very aggressive move with the idea of bringing one of these rooks over to d1 right away. But Hans Niemann, he's unfazed. Here, he has the option of going bishop e6 right away, attacking the queen. But instead, he plays this intermediate move, h6. Now, this move is very, very interesting. Obviously here, Hans Niemann, he sees the idea of rook ad1 or rook fd1. Or if he didn't, I mean, of course, he's going to be a future world champion. This guy has to see this move right here. So you have to see it. So why did he play h6 instead of simply bishop e6 right away? That is the more obvious move. It's the more natural one. I mean, you develop peace, attack the queen, and so on. Avoid these ideas right away. So why did he go here? Well, in the post-game conference, Hans Niemann said he actually expected this exact line from Magnus, and he actually reviewed these lines with the computer before the game that very morning. And he had a very interesting idea in mind. So h6 was the move. Now Magnus, here it turns out taking on f6 is the right choice like this. But in this position, Magnus, he fell for Hans Niemann's trap. He played the move rook fd1. Now, this move, at first glance, looks very, very obvious. I probably would have played it myself. The idea is you're trying to drive away the queen. For example, if the queen goes, say, here to e7, then you take on f6, and the queen wasted a move going to e7 first, and then to f6 like that, versus to f6 in one move right away. So, rook fd1, it makes a lot of sense. There's just one problem with this move. Here, Hans Niemann, he played the other intermediate move, bishop to e6. So Hans Niemann, meeting the intermediate move, rook fd1, of course, ignoring the attack on the bishop, rook fd1, and in response, Hans plays an intermediate move of his own, bishop to e6 like this. Now, was this all opening preparation? Did he see all of this in advance? Did he have all of it memorized? I don't know, but it certainly seems like it's a possibility. But now, keep in mind, Hans Niemann, so far, he spent about 14 minutes versus the less than 1 minute for Magnus. So Magnus so far has literally blitzed out all of his moves, getting right to this position where technically he's a little bit worse. So Magnus has no one to blame but himself for blitzing out all of his moves just to get a worse position as white. I mean, he could have spent a little more time on the prior move, thinking through the implications of rook fd1 and trying to see if black went here, what would happen. But he didn't, and he gets swiftly punished in this game. Now, from here, what should white be doing? Well, you can move the queen to, say, b5, but then you lose the bishop, so you can't do that. Instead, Magnus here, he takes on d8 like this. Rook takes d8, likely the best move, and black takes on c4. Bishop takes c4. Now, both sides lose their queens, so we now have an endgame or a queenless middle game, whatever you want to call it. I call it an endgame, but c'est la vie. But more importantly now, the rook on d8, it is hanging. It's being attacked by literally 3 pieces. So Magnus here, he can either trade on f8 or a8, or he can technically go back to, say, d2 or d1. But the problem with that, if you go back, you still lose the bishop on g5 right here. So you essentially have to trade the rook on f8 or a8 for one of the other rooks. So in the game, rook takes a8 was played. Then we have rook takes, and then bishop takes f6, and then g takes f6. From here, king to f1. The king slides over and enters the game. Now, Hans, rook d8, a logical move, sliding back over, centralizing the rook, controlling the d file like this. So far, so good. Magnus, king to e1, getting his king centralized and also breaking free of the pin on the e2 pawn. Now the pawn technically can advance forward in this game. So this is a good time to slow down and talk strategy. After all, both sides have played all of the logical ideas. The king's over, the rook's over, and so on. So what is going on in this endgame, and why is Hans Niemann the one who's a little bit better here? Well, first of all, both sides have these really bad pawn structures. Hans Niemann has the bad pawns on the king's side, but white has the bad pawns on the queen's side. For the most part, those things kind of cancel each other out. Although having your king on the king's side like this means these pawns are easier to defend, versus these pawns on the queen's side will likely be harder to defend as white. Beyond that, black has these slightly, and I mean slightly more active pieces. The knight, the bishop, the rook, they're all doing a little bit more for black than they are doing for white. So overall, due to the activity of the pieces, also the king being close to the king's side to defend these pawns, overall Hans has a small edge in the endgame. It's not much, but it's certainly enough to let him play for a win. From here, Hans, knight to a5 is the move, a logical idea. The knight now clamps down on c4 and b3, but it also defends b2 in advance. That is important if white goes, say, rook to b1, pressuring that pawn, or if the knight moves to, say, d2, pressuring that pawn. In both cases, that pawn is supported. Now from here, Magnus, the move is rook d1. Okay, this is a very, very important moment right here. Hans, he has the option of trading rooks like this, and he has to calculate everything out. Is that going to be a good idea for him or a bad idea? Now, traditionally, when you have rooks on the board, it makes it easier to get a draw. Therefore, if Hans is playing for a win, he might consider trading. However, he also knows if you trade on d1 like this, the king slides over, and from there, it has access to c2, and from there, these pawns on the queen side will be defended perfectly, and Hans, he may not have as much winning chances if that happens. So instead, he plays the move rook to c8, sliding back over with the rook like this and pressuring the c3 pawn via the x-ray attack. A very good, very precise move. Now, Magnus, he's got to find some way to untangle his pieces. I mean, look at his pieces. His rook is actually well placed, but the knight and the bishop right now, literally right now, are doing absolutely nothing. The knight has access to literally no good squares. Everything is covered. The bishop's blocked in by the knight. Therefore, the first thing you have to do is you really have to find a better square for this knight. So, with that in mind, knight d2 makes a lot of sense. You drop back with the knight, pressure the bishop, set up ideas like knight to e4, a good square, pressuring f6, and of course the bishop now is active on this diagonal. In response, black, bishop e6. The bishop retreats back to the square where it all began, bishop to e6. In response, Magnus here, he's under a lot of pressure. I mean, Hans has good squares for his pieces. The bishop and the knight clamp down on c4. The pawn's defended. c3 is under attack. What do you do here as Magnus? I mean, technically, you can go, say, rook c1 defending, but in the endgame, you always want your rooks as active as possible. You never want them passive. So with that in mind here, Magnus, he digs deep. It's under a lot of pressure, and he plays a very, very double-edged pawn sack. He plays the move c4. Okay, what is the idea right here? Well, it's simple. He's giving up a pawn on c4 potentially in return for activity. For example, if black takes on c4 like this, white can trade and then win the pawn back on b7, and from there, white may have some chances. So c4, not a bad move at all, objectively, but also from a practical standpoint, when you're behind, when you can mix things up like this, it's always a good idea to give it a try. So a good move by the GOAT. Now, Hans, it turns out the best idea here is to ignore the pawn entirely and simply centralize your king like this. So king to f8 was the best move here. Instead, he takes the bait and he takes on c4. With this move, Magnus, as you can see with the eval bar shooting up, he's fighting back in this game, and the game is approximately equal. Now, white takes on c4, black takes back like this, rook takes c4 with the rook maintaining the defense of the pawn on b7. However, in return for giving up that single pawn, Magnus now has a tremendous amount of activity for his pieces, especially the bishop and the rook. And here we have rook d8, flying back to the back rank, giving the king the check on the g7 square, a good move overall. In response, king g7 is the move. Now, bishop d5, also a good move, pressuring the rook, also pressuring the pawn on the f7 square. Now, where is the rook going to go in response? It goes back to c7, rook c7, a good move, defending f7 in advance, which you need to do. If you go, say, I don't know, rook to c5, something like that, then rook d7 is super strong, and there's actually no good way to defend the pawn on s7. And white here would not be winning, but he would have a significant edge in this position. So, Hans finding the best square for the rook simply on c7, defending f7. In response, Magnus, rook to a8 is the move, attacking a7. And here, Hans shows why Magnus Carlsen accused him of cheating in this game. He plays the unthinkable idea of a6 defending the pawn. That's a joke, by the way. You know, very obvious move here. So far, Hans Niemann playing a good game of chess, but nothing really that spectacular. He found an idea in the opening, bishop e6, the intermediate move hitting the queen, leading to a good endgame. He's played solid in the endgame so far, but nothing spectacular. There's nothing that he's played so far that any other GM couldn't find. And Magnus so far is under a lot of pressure. All right, from here, Magnus, rook b8, pressuring the pawn on b7. Magnus is still the GOAT of endgames. Let's see what he can do in this game. Now, Hans here. This is a critical point in this game. White has a lot of pressure on this pawn on b7. The bishop and the rook both attack it, whereas the rook and the knight both defend on b7. So this is good for white. In chess, you always want to have maximum pressure on your opponent if you can. So Hans, he has two choices. One, you can sit back and defend and do nothing, or you can play for a win and go for the offensive idea. And the only good offensive idea right now is to push these kingside pawns down the board and bring your king down as well like this. So Hans, he finds the right idea. He plays the move f5. Not a crazy, insane, next level move, but certainly a very strong move and the best move on the chessboard. The idea, he wants to go e4, maybe even e3, and bring the king down to the center of the board. A very good idea. In response, white, rook to e8, pressuring this pawn and therefore forcing the move e4, but it turns out e4 was the idea all along, so Hans, he's not afraid to play this at all. Now here, Magnus, how do you defend against the idea of potentially e3 later in the game and just the king sliding down and so on? Well, it turns out moves like f3 are decent, moves like rook to d8 are decent, but instead, Magnus here, he plays another very committal idea. He plays the move g4, gaining space on the king side, but this move right here, there's one problem with it. It weakens the king side immensely, and Hans, he ignores the pawn at first, and he first goes rook to c5 like this, pressuring the bishop. In response, the bishop, it has to go back. Bishop a2 is the move, and now we have knight to c4. Hans Niemann ignoring the attack on the pawn. Of course, can always win it back later if he wants to, but he has bigger fish to fry. What is the idea here? We're about to find out. In response, Magnus here, he probably should take on c4, then take on f5 like this. If he finds this idea, Magnus would be doing okay. There's no checkmate. The king can always go to d2. White's doing okay. He still has decent drawing chances, but instead of all this, in the game, he goes a4. The idea being the pawn on a3 was under attack, so a4 does get rid of the attack on the pawn, but it's a little bit passive. And Hans, he goes back, knight d6 like this. What's the idea? Well, again, we're about to find out. Well, first of all, it does defend f5 and attack the rook, but beyond that, there's an even more sinister idea in mind here. All right, in response, Magnus, rook to e7 played, attacking f7. So there's a lot of pressure on the pawn now. Now the knight must stay on d6 to defend that pawn. But it turns out this is not the best square for the rook, and Magnus made another big mistake. He spent 5 minutes on this move, and it's the wrong square for the rook. Instead, rook to d8 was the best move here, attacking the rook on d6. Instead, rook e7, attacking the knight on d6. Instead, rook e7 played in the game. And now here, Hans has a number of very strong ideas, the strongest being rook c2, pressuring the bishop and the pawn on e2. Instead, he takes the pawn on g4, and this is also a bit of a mistake. In response, rook d7 was played by Magnus, rook d7 sliding over, pressuring the rook. But again, if you were going to do this, why wouldn't you go rook d8 first, attacking that knight right away instead of e7? I'm not entirely sure. It might have been a simple mistake by the goat. Now, here, Hans plays maybe the best move of the entire game from his perspective. He plays the move here, e3. Now, this is super, super, super strong. The idea is it's a deflection pawn sacrifice. You want to give up the e4 square for the knight. That way, if white takes, you jump in with your knight like this, and this did happen in the game. F takes, and then knight to e4, and now the threat is simply rook to c1 checkmate, as the knight controls these squares and the rook would control these squares right here. Now, of course, in this position right here, Magnus has the option of winning the knight on d6. However, that would be the biggest blunder of his career, maybe even bigger than the one that he recently played versus Gukesh in their classical game where Magnus slammed the board in the endgame. Now here, if you take on d6, Magnus did not do this in the game, but if you do this, the problem is rook c1 is winning. Here's the idea. First of all, the only legal move is rook d1. There's no other move for the king. There's no other way to block the attack, so rook d1 is forced. But then here, you can simply win two different ways. First of all, you can trade on d1 like this, then go e takes f2, and the king cannot get over to the defense, and you win. The other way to win, just as good, is taking it right away like this. If the king takes, you win the rook. And instead here, if the king goes to, say, d2, then you trade rooks and go f1, queen, and win the game anyway. So either way, after this move, rook c1 is winning. So Magnus here, he does not play that. Instead, he captures on e3, like this. F takes e3. Now, in response, as promised, Hans Niemann, knight d4, he jumps in, threatening checkmate in like one or two moves here. Now, of course, if you take the pawn on f7, that can easily lead to massive, and I mean massive, problems for white. So instead, Magnus here, king to f1 is the move. He slides over the king. Then rook c1, king g2. That is the entire idea of king to f1. trying to run away with the king. But Hans Niemann, this guy is relentless. Rook c2 is the move. Not a very hard move to find, but a very good move, attacking both the bishop and the pawn on the e2 square. Now, from here, we have the move bishop takes f7. Magnus winning the pawn on f7, a good idea, and also opening up all kinds of discovered attacks on the king. For example, bishop to d5, check, attacking the king and the knight is now being threatened. Therefore, Hans, he has to respond immediately and precisely. In the game, he takes on e2. Rook takes e2 is the move. Now, where is the king going to go? It goes to g1. Then we have rook e1, king g2, rook e2, king g1. And here, Magnus, he's offering a draw, more or less. If Hans wants it, if he wants a draw versus the goat, he goes back and forth, and so does white. Back and forth, and it would be a draw. Instead, Hans, he's playing for a win. King to f6. The king march begins. Very good stuff. In response, bishop d5 attacks that knight on the e4 square. Now, we have rook d2, pinning the bishop to the rook on d7. If you take the knight, you lose the rook and the game. Therefore, that is not a possibility. In response, rook to f7 by Magnus attacks the king on f6. Then we have king to g6. The king slides over. And then here, Magnus makes one of the last fatal mistakes of this game. The right move here is simply rook to e7, attacking the knight. That way, if black wins the bishop, white wins the knight, and white is doing okay. Instead, rook d7 was played, and here, Hans finds a series of very strong moves. First of all, knight to g5, the threat being, of course, knight to f3, hits the king with check, and if you take the knight, you lose the rook, as the rook is now pinned. A very strong idea. In response, bishop f7 hits the king, and the king, of course, cannot go to h5, but instead, it goes to f5. And keep in mind, this move right here, by Magnus, a big mistake. Bishop f7 was not the way to go, but instead is played in the game. Bishop f7, king to f5, Hans closing in with his king. Rook takes d2 is played now, and it may look like white is winning the rook, but Hans has everything under control. This was the entire idea of knight g5 played earlier, right here, setting up a future fork with the king and the white rook on d2. Let's see how it happens. Knight g5, bishop f7, king f5, rook takes d2, and then the key move, knight to f3, winning back the piece on the spot and getting good winning chances if I can draw arrows correctly. So king g2, knight takes, a5, Magnus pushing the pawn, trying to fight back, but in response, king to e5, the king slides over. Now, king g3, knight f1, the triple fork on the king, the pawn, and the pawn. A very aesthetically pleasing move here by Hans Niemann, the future world champion. Now, king f2 in response, and Hans, he simply takes the pawn on h2, not being worried about losing the knight, as the knight can always go to f3 later if it needs to. Now, e4, king takes e4, bishop e6, king to f4. Hans Niemann being up 3 pawns in the endgame versus the GOAT. Magnus is not long for this world in this game, so to speak. Now, bishop c8 attacks the pawn on b7, knight to f3, bishop takes b7, knight e5, bishop takes. So Magnus here winning 2 pawns on the queen side on a6 and b7. But now Hans, these pawns on the king side are simply too far advanced, and there is no stopping them. Knight c6, bishop b7, knight takes a5, bishop d5, h5, bishop f7, h4, bishop d5, and now king to e5 attacks the bishop. And in this position, Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, he resigns on the spot to Hans Niemann, meaning Hans Niemann officially wins this game versus Magnus in the 2022 Sinquefield Cup Tournament. And now for the big question, did Hans Niemann cheat in this game versus Magnus Carlsen, the most famous game of chess ever played? And my answer now is the same as it was a year ago when I first covered this game on my YouTube channel. No, he did not cheat. That much is so painfully obvious to anyone with half a brain. And by the way, I might be the only chess YouTuber, only person in the chess space who a year ago was saying this and who's saying it right now. There's literally no one else who's going to say that, which is absolutely shocking. You know, you can make of that what you will, but no one else is willing to state the obvious. So here I am being forced to do it myself. And let's go back. In the opening, nothing even remotely interesting happened in the opening. I mean, Hans Niemann playing e5, not exactly a hard move to find. And also the only interesting thing here was this move bishop e6, but also again, not a hard move to find. Magnus here blitzing out all of his moves, spending almost no time to get to a worse endgame out of the opening. Why didn't Magnus spend more time in the opening here? It's not really obvious to me. He just goes to a worse endgame, blitzing out all of his moves, rapid fire. And from there, in the endgame, there really wasn't anything that interesting that happened. I mean, Hans, he just kind of slowly outplayed Magnus. The only really strong idea by Hans was the idea of f5 and then e4 and eventually e3 that we saw right here. But beyond that, Hans didn't really do anything that spectacular in the endgame. And even these moves, f5 and e3, they weren't exactly like the hardest moves ever to find in history of the game. So Hans won a pretty simple, straightforward game versus Magnus. Magnus got a worse game out of the opening with the exact opening line he wanted, where he blitzed out all his moves, and then he gets worse, and then he gets slowly outplayed in the endgame. And by the way, Magnus made a bunch, and I mean a bunch of minor mistakes, or maybe not minor, maybe larger mistakes in the endgame. So Magnus just misplayed the opening, misplayed the endgame. What else can you say? So I like Magnus. You know, he's a great player. He's the greatest player of all time. I enjoy doing his games. I'm doing, like, you know, almost nonstop Magnus games here. I'm milking Magnus for all his worth. He plays some amazing chess games. But let's face it, Hans here in this game, he simply outplayed the GOAT, no questions asked. So that is my opinion. And it's the same as it was 1 year ago. Again, I'm the only person a year ago and even today on YouTube covering chess games. Kind of afraid to state the obvious, but I digress. Anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button, comment down below. Who do you support, Magnus or Hans? What do you think of the whole, you know, cheating scenario thing? Do you agree with me that Hans did not cheat in this game and simply beat Magnus fair and square in this game? Let me know down below. I'd love to hear from you. And as always, I wish you the best of luck in your chess improvement journey in 2025 and beyond. And I'll see you in the next video.